Gain control of cyber risk with Tenable.io, the first vulnerability management platform built for today's elastic assets like cloud, containers, and web apps. Discover a fresh, asset-based approach that prioritizes vulnerabilities while seamlessly integrating into your environment. And improve ROI with the first elastic licensing approach based on assets, not IP addresses. Tenable.io delivers the data and context you need to secure your elastic attack surface. Start your free Tenable.io trial today by visiting Tenable.io. In order to deliver the maximum degree of privacy, personal data must be protected without action from an individual. In fact, this requirement is defined in the General Data Protection Regulation, also known as GDPR. What if you could reliably and efficiently build privacy into your information security programs by default? StealthBits Technologies provides solutions that allow data to be collected and used in a manner that achieves GDPR compliance. Privacy by design and by default is not just a GDPR requirement, it's the foundation of StealthBits Technologies. Visit stealthbits.com to learn more today. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. This is more of a topic discussion on my IoC Enchanted Quadrants. That's right. I do have an announcement, I think, or two. I might have an announcement or two. Hold on.
I'm excited. I got my chips and my mute button. I'm ready to go. It's going to be awesome.
So the announcement is, I guess I don't have any more announcements. Wild West Hack and Fest, that's an announcement, right? That's happening. Training and talks. And Grim and Sands. Wild West Hack and Fest, there it is. Go there, wildwesthackandfest.com, HACKIN fest.com. Check it out. We'll all be there.
And Bo and I have decided we're going to do a metal show in my garage during that, so that'll be fun.
It's going to be awesome. Metal for the win. Make sure you check out Grim's Crossbow. We're actually talking about endpoint detection and response. Learn how to test your detection and response capabilities with Grim's Crossbow. And what was the last one? Oh, Sands Pentest Hackfest Summit is coming up. Make sure you go check them out on the web and attend that conference because it's going to be awesome and we're going to be there. And John will probably be there too.
More than likely.
That's good. Alrighty. So my Enchanted Quadrant, I don't know where this kind of like evolved over time and evolved to the point where I had quadrants. And I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. I have quadrants now. And I needed a place because I was getting a lot of questions about, well, how do I detect IOCs? And those were breaking down into multiple different categories. And I'm really like, you need all four of these areas, in my opinion, to be able to detect IOCs in your environment. Now, this leaves a lot out, right? It's kind of laser focused into, you've got these four areas of potential detection of data or discovering data about the attacks that are happening or maybe not happening in your environment. And you need a way to consolidate all of them. Now, I will say, I don't really have, there's no silver bullet in security, and there's certainly no silver bullet when it comes to, I can take data from all these sources, I can put it in a dashboard, and my SOC analyst can read it, and they know exactly where we're being attacked and how, and can respond efficiently. Companies do this, varying degrees of success. There's really nothing that I could point and say, well, everyone should be doing this. It's different for every organization. Some develop their own tools. Some integrate multiple tools together. But the first quadrant is endpoint protection, which we talked about pretty much in depth on this episode already. And I broke endpoint protection down into two different categories. There's the more traditional antivirus, or AV, right? And that's the file-based stuff that Mike was talking about. Also, I think the larger vendors have come out with more advanced features that you can enable. And as John has proven to us, a lot of that comes down to configuration. And those options are available. And rip and replace cost is certainly in there as well. Do you want to rip out your traditional AV for something new? Do you want to ride something on top of it? And typically what you'd ride on top of that, or maybe replace it with, who knows, is what I called New Wave endpoint protection and response. Or it should be endpoint detection, protection, and response, right? And that's the slew of vendors that Endgame in Mike's role has to deal with. And we didn't name names, but obviously there's a lot of vendors in that space, all touting some kind of new features and functionality. A lot of people messaging correctly and incorrectly on artificial intelligence and machine learning. But that's the second kind of space underneath endpoint protection. So then we move right in the quadrant and we talk about SIEM and logs and event monitoring. And really, that kind of boils down into two separate areas, in my opinion. That's the big SIEM, right? And we don't know who the vendors are there. They collect and try to analyze. The keyword is their try. And I think that's where a lot of people have discovered the shortcomings in their big SIEM. Hey, we can collect everything. This is great. We're compliant. And we can try to analyze stuff to be secure, but we really can't. The second category under SIEM is a SIEM with targeted features. EUBA, so-called security intelligence. One of them is a sponsor of the show, right? Their moniker is security intelligence, talking about logarithm. And they're trying to basically extend SIEM to be more intelligent and do more targeted things with that. Some of them are trying to replace the big SIEM. Some of them are trying to supplement that as well. So you're getting logs and event information in addition to some endpoint stuff. Then we move into network detection and prevention, right? This is where I put next generation firewalls. You know, they do some WAF stuff. They do some protocol analysis as well. And that's the next generation firewalls. Then there's network-based threat hunting, right? There's actually looking at the network traffic. John and I happen to have a startup in this area. Lots of other vendors are here too. They're looking at the network traffic because the network doesn't lie, and you're trying to derive where attacks may have taken place or where attacks could be taking place by analyzing network attacks. The fourth quadrant is threat intelligence. And I broke that down into two different areas. There's what I call concrete threat intelligence. So these are your IP addresses, domains, specific malware signatures, URLs that are known to be bad out there somewhere in the world, and you're trying to take that data inside of your environment and make sense of it. That's what I call concrete threat intelligence, for lack of a better term. The other type of intelligence is attacker intelligence. So they're monitoring the dark web specific to your environment. And some vendors do both. But I put a different category, Flashpoint as an example, just because this space is somewhat new in coming on the enterprise radar. I called it attacker threat intelligence. So they're doing the dark web monitoring, seeing who may be targeting your specific industry vertical or exactly targeting your organization to get ahead of the curve. So you're taking data from all four of these places, you're trying to make sense of it so that someone can take action. And that's really the kind of the heart of what we're trying to accomplish when we talk about our SOC being effective, when we talk about indicators of compromise as a thing and security monitoring as a thing. I think these are the four categories, each broken down into two different subcategories that you need to be worried about. Mike and John, first thoughts on the four categories, then some insight for our listeners on maybe how you correlate and actually take action on what's coming from these four areas.
Well, I think that it's a foundation, right? It's like the things, if you're going to focus on, these are the things you need to focus on. And on the break, I talked about how the threat intelligence quadrant needs to be clarified to look at the tactics that bad guys can use. We've talked about it many, many times on the show, the MITRE attack matrix. Mm-hmm. And that's what you need to be focusing on, is what are the techniques the bad guys are going to use. Because I like to look at those techniques as Lego blocks. If you're trying to detect a specific thing, but the thing can change all the time, if we can detect the Lego blocks that attacks are made of, and each of those individual components, and we can detect those individual components, then we have a much better security support structure than trying to develop an architecture that is going to match this particular APT group, mm-hmm. Shadow Panda 52. It's just a waste of time of trying to do that level of attribution to the attacker. But if we know their techniques, that's the type of threat intelligence that I can get behind, of course. Mm-hmm. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with focusing on something like the matrix to figure out where, and I would go broader into all the quadrants, because as a buyer, you might be persuaded to buy a network security monitoring tool and then an endpoint tool, and they might overlap in a lot of capabilities. For example, if your endpoint tool is like you mentioned, AV-centric or file-centric, and you have a network tool that is really fantastic at finding files on the wire, maybe you want to stretch that a bit or look across those techniques or the tactics and say, well, maybe I need to focus more on something that's going to help me with command and control, or something more helps me with exfiltration. And the same way with the log collection and the SIEM side. If you skip, or you don't have a lot of people don't have the cash to buy everything they want, right? It's not unlimited funding here. Maybe they can buy or utilize logs to help them with the collection side of the tactics instead of relying on some DLP type product either on the network or on the endpoint. But I like the foundation a lot, and I think, like you mentioned, breaking it across to see where the gaps lie across maybe the matrix is a good way to figure out where you can get the most coverage with the least amount of expenditure on both the purchase side and also on the people side of using the products.
No, those are good factors to consider. There are some vendors that play in all four of the quadrants. I'm not sure how. If so, let me put it out there this way: if you're listening or watching, and you have a vendor that you're like, well, they play in all four of these quadrants, and they do a good job. We want to hear about that. I think there are certain large vendors, and the one that does come to mind, Palo Alto, certainly I think plays in all four of these areas. How well, I'm not sure. I'd be curious to see and hear from our listeners about how that's working out. But there are a lot of vendors that do that. In fact, Rapid7 could also potentially play in all four of these quadrants. And these are larger companies that have made acquisitions that basically have given them an entire quadrant because of an acquisition, right? Palo Alto bought Light Cyber, and that just put them right in, now they cover both points under network detection and prevention. And of course, a lot of the vendors integrate with threat intelligence or have their own or both. And believe it or not, Palo Alto is playing in the SIEM side as well, is something they just released. So I thought it was kind of interesting. I don't think it's for everyone, right? Not everyone's going to be able to go to one vendor and say, I want you to do all my IoC stuff. I think Mike very clearly points out that there's gaps in the way that each of these technologies work, and some have strengths and weaknesses, and some cover things in different ways. But this is kind of how I kind of build the foundation, and then we have a conversation about how you're going to implement these technologies and other technologies, and how you glue things together. I think is really the big point of everyone glues these things together differently. How you tie together all four of these quadrants and report up to something, Mike, you pointed out there might be something that detects files on the wire and, detects files on the endpoint. How do you get those two things talking to each other maybe before you report back up to the dashboard, or how the dashboard normalizes that data? So there's lots of great talking points that I think can come from this, which is why I use it as kind of a starting point in a lot of conversations with organizations.
Yeah, I think you rightly asked me earlier about integration. I would caution and urge every SOC team to fully implement a tool they bring on board before they go looking for the next one. I mean, how many companies have you talked to or been engaged with that have this shelfware where they purchase some new product that doesn't get used? And it's not good if it's not ultimately providing data to an analyst that they can use to react on. And you rightly kind of put those quadrants around sort of a centralized focus, or sort of the analyst focus, because like you mentioned, if the endpoint and the network products aren't working in concert together in a way that the analyst can use, then they're worthless. They don't, or I shouldn't say worthless, but they diminish their value. So integrations and analyst efficiency, I think, is a key part to consider when you look at any of those four pieces to purchase.
Yeah, and a lot of times I'll see a particular organization that has an investment in vendor X, and vendor X just bought, vendor A, and they go out and they buy a different vendor, Y, and I'm like, well, that vendor A provides the same thing as vendor Y, and it was just part of your vendor X. So that happens a lot, and I think it's just a time shifting thing, because you bought your next generation firewall. You've implemented it, you're happy with it, and then you've already started the process of looking for a solution for something else that maybe integrates with it. In that time, that next generation firewall vendor picked up another vendor that could potentially solve that problem for you. And that's something that should be evaluated, because they're going to work really hard to integrate that, hopefully, with and make all their tools work together. So that's a lot of what I think is some of the heart and soul of this show, right, is keeping tabs on all that so we know what to evaluate inside of our environments and get the cost down. And it's interesting. You may think, well, I've got the big vendor's products and they just bought a smaller vendor. I should be able to get that smaller vendor's functionality that just joined bigger vendor for cheaper, right? That should be monetarily less expensive for me because I'm doing it all with one vendor. And a lot of times it's not. A lot of times you can go out and buy a completely different vendor solution that might work better for you for less price. And a lot of times it's the reverse. So, it all requires evaluating security products, I think, is something we will continue to cover, of course, and something that needs a lot of work. We're going to cover it in an upcoming webcast as it's focused on endpoint protection and detection and prevention. So I think it's all good stuff that we can talk about. Are you enchanted now, John?
I'm just figuring out how we can incorporate Enchanted into most of our marketing swag from here on out.
Yes.
Because it's brilliant.
You'll be enchanted.
Enchanted Security. TM that.
That's right. That's the new company, Enchanted Security. Well, John, thank you very much as always. Mike, it was wonderful having you on as a guest on this episode. We appreciate all of your thoughts and insights you've shared with us and our listeners and viewers.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching. That concludes this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. See everyone next time.